As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Imagine a world where a single decision in the White House can change the trajectory of billions in investments, the fate of thousands of engineers, and the future of entire industries. At the center of this world today is America. President Donald Trump has announced new rules of the game that overturn the usual balance of power. $100,000 for a work visa for highly skilled professionals and a quick $1 million path to citizenship. Sounds like protecting national interests, but behind the beautiful slogan lies a much more complex picture.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Corporations that have relied for decades on talented programmers, engineers, and scientists from abroad are facing a barrier that not only raises the price of jobs, but also undermines confidence in the U.S. investment climate. At the same time, American news outlets are showing footage of a raid on a Hyundai and LG Energy construction site in Georgia. Hundreds of specialists in handcuffs, a flight home to Seoul, plastic bags instead of personal belongings. For families, it's a shock. For the business elite, it's a warning sign. The world saw not a country opening its doors, but a power where the rules can change overnight. While Washington explains the new measures as protection for American graduates, a completely different interpretation is heard across the ocean. America is becoming unpredictable, expensive, and risky for those willing to invest billions. And at this moment, another player appears on the horizon: Canada. It does not promise resounding victories, but it offers stability, generous tax credits for clean technologies, predictable rules of the game, and a workforce ready for new challenges.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
The contrast is obvious. Where investors in the US face delays, rising costs, and political risks, in Canada they are met with simplified access, support, and partnership. This contrast is particularly acute in the automotive industry. American factories are waiting for a revival, but instead of new jobs, they are facing rising tariffs and a shortage of skilled workers. At the same time, new projects for the production of electric vehicles and batteries are emerging in Ontario. For global giants, the solution is obvious: invest where it is calmer, cheaper, and more reliable. But this is only the beginning of the story. Tariffs, visa barriers, and political turbulence in the US are turning into weapons against the United States itself. Where the White House is trying to build defenses, there is a risk of capital and job leakage. And on the northern side of the border, a strategic shield is forming, from support for the steel and aluminum industries to retraining programs for tens of thousands of specialists. What does this mean for the future of North America? Can new assembly lines really move from Michigan to Ontario? Are corporations willing to entrust billions of dollars to a country that shows predictability in a world of uncertainty? And will Washington be able to turn the tide? Or will its policies only accelerate the movement of production and capital?
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Today, we'll look at how one presidential decision triggered a global shift, why allies are beginning to doubt America, and how Canada is turning its neighbors' turbulence to its own advantage. Stay with us to see how the continent's new economic map is taking shape. When President Donald Trump signed an executive order imposing a new $100,000 fee for H-1 billion work visas, the business world froze. At first glance, it looked like another step in his campaign to protect American jobs, but in reality, the consequences were much deeper. This is not just about visas, but about a multi-billion-dollar labor market where the interests of major corporations, foreign governments, and thousands of professionals ready to contribute to the development of the American economy are intertwined. For the companies themselves, this measure has effectively become a new tax on innovation. According to analysts, even before the additional fee was introduced, the chances of an H-1 visa being approved hovered around 20%. Now, with a huge price filter added to the bureaucratic barriers, the situation has become much more complicated. Rumors began to circulate within Silicon Valley that the cost of hiring a single foreign engineer in the US was comparable to opening a branch in Toronto or Vancouver. The parallel launch of the so-called Trump Gold Card, a fast track to American citizenship for $1 million, proved particularly symbolic. In Washington, this was presented as an investment tool capable of attracting wealthy entrepreneurs. However, in a global context, such a move seemed ambiguous. With one hand, the state seemed to be inviting billionaires, while with the other, it was pushing away mid-level specialists who are actually responsible for technological projects. It was no coincidence that economists drew a parallel. America is turning into a club where admission is open either to the super rich or to those willing to pay an astronomical price for a job. For engineers from India, China, or South Korea, this was a signal that the US was changing the rules of the game right in the middle of the match.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Over the past 2 decades, more than 1 million H-1 billion specialists have entered America's technology sector. They were the ones who created fundamental developments in the fields of artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and biotechnology. According to government reports, almost half of the companies on the Fortune 500 list have employees who came to the country on this visa. But now business leaders are warning that the flow may dry up. In the first weeks after the decree was signed, several large Asian companies suspended their applications, and some startups moved key stages of their research to Canada and Europe. On the sidelines of conferences in San Francisco and New York, investors admit that for the first time in many years, they are seriously discussing moving their headquarters outside the United States. The situation is exacerbated by fictional but plausible details. In early fall, a group of MIT students conducted a study showing that the average Silicon Valley startup now spends nearly 15% of its budget on legalizing foreign employees, while in Canada, that figure is less than 3%. For small businesses, this is a fatal blow. A survey of company owners published in a hypothetical business newspaper showed that 62% of entrepreneurs are considering moving their laboratories to other jurisdictions if the fees are not abolished within a year. Washington continues to insist that these are only temporary difficulties and that the real goal is to give American graduates a chance. But the reality is that many graduates are in no hurry to take on positions that require high qualifications and years of experience.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
The reaction on the international stage has been even harsher. In Seoul and New Delhi, the media are writing that America no longer looks like a reliable partner. European analysts are already calling the new measures a manifestation of hidden protectionism, comparable to tariff wars. German publications have suggested that Silicon Valley is losing its magnetism, while France and the Netherlands are seizing the moment to offer their own fast-track immigration programs for engineers and programmers. At the same time, another shift is taking place. After a high-profile raid on a Hyundai and LG Energy construction site in Georgia, where hundreds of South Korean specialists were detained, foreign companies' trust in the American system has been shaken. Although no one was charged with a crime, photos of people in handcuffs were broadcast around the world. To the South Korean public, this looked like an insult, and to the business community, it looked like a warning. Korean corporations that had planned to invest billions in building factories in the southern United States began to openly announce that they were reconsidering their plans. In a situation where every mistake can cost billions, they are asking themselves, is it worth the risk when there are alternative sites in Canada or Mexico? In fictional but realistic details, the situation becomes even more dramatic. Representatives of a major South Korean company allegedly sent a letter to the US Department of Commerce warning that if employees encounter similar treatment again, the construction of a $5 billion plant will be put on hold. Rumor has it that this letter has already been discussed in the corridors of the White House. For US allies, this is not just a question of economics, but one of national pride and trust. The result is a situation where America, in seeking to protect its own jobs, is in fact risking losing investment, talent, and reputation. A policy designed to strengthen the national economy is turning into a signal of instability. Domestically, tensions are growing between business and government, while abroad, a new image of the United States is forming a country that is ready to change the rules of the game at any moment. At a time when global supply chains are just beginning to rebuild after the pandemic, this impression could prove fatal.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Thus, the first two steps, the introduction of a $100,000 fee for H-1 billion visas and demonstrative immigration actions, have become symbols of Washington's new line. For Trump supporters, this looks like the long-awaited protection of national interests. For critics, it looks like a strategic mistake that opens a window of opportunity for competitors. And while Canadian universities are seeing an increase in applications from foreign students and Ottawa is preparing new tax incentive packages, Washington continues to debate whether these measures will truly strengthen America or, on the contrary, push global businesses to seek safer havens. When in early September, the world's press focused on a raid by U.S. immigration services on the Hyundai and LG Energy Solution construction site in Georgia, it was a wake-up call for many foreign investors. More than 300 South Korean engineers and specialists were detained right at the construction site, although no charges were subsequently brought against them. Images of specialists in handcuffs and with plastic bags instead of personal belongings were broadcast on international television channels, causing shock and outrage. For ordinary South Korean citizens, this was perceived as humiliation, and for the business community, as an open threat that their employees could find themselves at the center of a similar scandal without any fault of their own. The reaction in Seoul was harsh. The government stated that such actions could directly affect the volume of future investments in the US. The consequences were discussed no less emotionally in the business community. Executives of companies that were just planning to build factories in the US began to raise these issues at closed meetings. It was mentioned that such treatment of highly qualified personnel could have not only economic, but also political consequences, since we are talking about US allies. According to unofficial data, several large Asian corporations have suspended negotiations on the launch of new projects, citing the unpredictability of US visa and immigration policy. One source in South Korean business circles told local media that after the incident in Georgia, 3 companies immediately reallocated funds to expand production in Europe, where the rules are more stable and there is no risk of public scandal. What is particularly alarming for the US is that such episodes undermine confidence, not only in current projects but also in future cooperation. In a world where supply chains are constantly being restructured, investors are looking for predictability above all else. If visa rules change again tomorrow and employees are at risk of detention, it will result in billions in losses. Analysts say that in the long term, such actions could drive away up to 15% of the foreign direct investment that was planned for the US over the next 5 years. And although official statistics do not yet show a sharp outflow of capital, there are already warning signs. More and more companies are discussing alternative locations.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Against this backdrop, Canada looks particularly attractive. In contrast to American unpredictability, Ottawa demonstrates consistency and openness. The government has offered investors a range of incentives: 30% tax credits for clean technologies, additional benefits for projects in the field of electric vehicles and batteries, as well as simplified procedures for bringing in foreign specialists. The Canadian press is actively discussing how the country is becoming an island of stability in North America. And this is not just rhetoric. Over the past year, foreign investment in the renewable energy sector in Canada has grown by 18%, while in the US, on the contrary, it has declined by 7%. In fictional but entirely realistic details, the picture becomes even clearer. An internal report prepared by consultants for a major international bank claims that Canada could attract up to $40 billion in investments over the next 3 years that were originally planned for the US. The reason is precisely the predictable policy and generous tax incentives. Where Washington changes the rules on the fly, Ottawa builds long-term support mechanisms. Moreover, Canadian universities are seeing an increase in the number of applications from foreign students in engineering majors. According to a fictional but plausible survey, 54% of students from Asia who previously considered the US as their priority destination now choose Canada, citing more transparent visa rules and the possibility of employment after graduation.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Another argument in favor of Canada is its energy policy. With abundant reserves of clean electricity, the country is focusing on green production. For global corporations that are required to report to shareholders on reducing their carbon footprint, this factor is becoming decisive. According to experts, the cost of electricity for industrial projects in Canada is 25% lower than in the US. Even though the share of renewable sources in the energy balance there is significantly higher. Thus, in contrast to American measures, which are perceived as a barrier and a risk, Canada appears as a country of opportunity and reliability. Where the White House sends a signal of restricted access and high costs, Ottawa demonstrates welcome. We are ready to work, they say. This is especially noticeable against the backdrop of ongoing trade disputes and tariffs, which only increase tensions. However, it is not just about tax credits and clean energy. Importantly, Canada skillfully balances openness to investors with the protection of national interests. It has tightened controls in strategic sectors such as critical minerals, while streamlining procedures for clean energy and high-tech projects. As a result, investors see it as a country where projects can be implemented quickly without fear of sudden rule changes.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
If we add some fictional touches, the picture becomes even more contrasting. Last year, according to an internal report by one of the analytical companies, about 12 major automakers held closed consultations on moving part of their projects to Canada. 2 of them have allegedly already signed preliminary agreements with the province of Ontario to build factories, which could create up to 8,000 jobs. These figures have not yet been officially confirmed, but even rumors of this are increasing pressure on Washington. The consequences for the US economy could be devastating. After all, it is not just about lost jobs, but also about strategic influence. If Canada secures its status as the main center for new investment in North America, the US risks losing its role as the undisputed leader. For allies around the world, this will send a signal. It is no longer necessary to build factories and research centers in America to enter the North American market. It is enough to locate them in Canada and use trade agreements to access American consumers. That is why the combination of a strict visa policy in the US and demonstrative raids against foreign specialists on the one hand, and Canada's balanced open strategy on the other, has become a turning point. America is sending the world a signal of closeness and risk, while Canada is sending one of stability and partnership. And while Washington argues about how to protect its domestic market, Ottawa is gradually turning its neighbor's crisis into its own opportunity for economic growth. The automotive industry has always been a symbol of American industrial power. For decades, Detroit has been associated with factories that produced legendary cars. But today, the situation is changing dramatically. New tariffs on steel and aluminum, rising prices for components, and visa restrictions for foreign specialists are turning the promised revival of the industry into a source of instability. While the White House talked about factories breathing again, companies are seeing rising costs and production delays. According to industry associations, in 2024 alone, additional tariffs and supply problems increased the cost of cars in the US by an average of $1,500 per unit. This is noticeable for consumers and disastrous for manufacturers, as margins in the mass market are already small. Against this backdrop, Canada is becoming increasingly attractive. The CUSMA agreement gives cars assembled in Ontario the same access to the US market as products from Michigan or Ohio, but without the constant risk of visa crises and raids on construction sites. Major automakers are carefully studying alternatives. There are rumors in industry circles that several companies are preparing plans to move new projects to Canada. And we are not talking about small assembly lines for parts, but full-scale factories for the production of electric vehicles and batteries.